Appreciate it. Thank you for having me, sir. Cool. Thank you. I'm pleased to help close up the day. I understand it's been an interesting day of discussion and dialogue. So I'll go through a little bit of an introduction on three theses I'd like to offer you. I think the token hat that I'm supposed to wear here is to provide a view from the biopharma industry. I'm a little bit of a peculiar choice for that because I think some of the views that I will share may or may not be shared by other members of the biopharma industry, but I'll do my best to fill that seat today. And if we have some time at the end, we'll take some Q&A and warm things up before the reception soon to follow. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Roivant, I thought I'd just give you a minute or two of background just so you have context on my vantage point and where I'm coming from. And then we'll get into the three theses that I wanted to share with all of you. A bit about the company. I founded it in 2014. We're a unique type of biopharma company with a very different structure. 32 drug programs across our pipeline. We have one that we have initiated a filing for approval earlier this year for a very rare disease. 6 phase 3 studies reading out in much broader disease populations next year. Drugs spanning late stage, early phase, mid-phase development across the board. No commercial products yet, but with the hope and expectation of that changing next year. About 700 employees at our company, and primarily building our pipeline through partnerships with large pharma companies, with small biotech companies, as well as in an increasing way with academic institutions to unlock earlier stage innovation in biopharma. So that's a little bit about me and the company, so you have some background. The thing I'd like to share or like to offer you today are three theses from the vantage point of biopharma. And all three of these, while independent, and I'll go through each of them in turn, each of these relate to my view of misallocation of investment resources relative to where real problems in healthcare ultimately lie. So the first of those is that I believe we have underallocated investment into improving the drug development process relative to advances in drug discovery. And to say a word more about where I'm coming from there. We are in an era of unprecedented productivity in the discovery of new medicines and advances in basic biology that are resulting in a whole wave of new therapeutics that were only dreams even 10 years ago. Cell and gene therapies, regenerative tissue-based therapies, all having potential real impact to patient lives and even the healthcare system at large. But the rate-limiting step to unlocking the value out of that innovation is actually a cumbersome drug development process, including human clinical trials, going through phase 1, 2, and 3, ultimately translating those into approved medicines. That's where the silent problem rests. And as I'll say in a moment when I get to it, I believe the keys to improving drug commercialization also rest in improving that development process. So that's the first thesis. The second, shifting gears from drug development to the broader discussion that's been had over the course of the day about the promise, dare I say, the buzzwords of AI and machine learning as applied to healthcare data. I believe we see overinvestment, especially from the VC community today, in new companies developing novel machine learning algorithms, novel computational power, novel AI approaches to analyzing healthcare data, when in fact the real rate-limiting step to unlocking analytic insight from healthcare data isn't the computing power, it is the availability of conformed, linked, joined, or aggregated healthcare data sets themselves. So that's the second thesis. And third is internal to biopharma R&D investment. I personally believe that there is a mismatch today between where we see most R&D resources going from our industry relative to the most pressing problems in US healthcare today, and in ways that actually have the risk of increasing overall healthcare costs, rather than focused R&D investments that could be made in new therapeutics and innovation that could actually contribute to reducing the cost curve that we're seeing in areas ranging from complications of obesity and diabetes to neurodegenerative diseases to other areas that we can discuss. And I have a tantalizing proposal at the end for how to potentially address and really bring all stakeholders together to steer that R&D investment back in the right direction. So that's really the entirety of it. I'm really just going to spend the rest of the time mostly repeating myself, but illuminating each of these three theses in further detail and taking some questions at the end. So for those of you who would come from biopharma, this risks being even trite, but I take it that many of you in the audience may come from other segments of the healthcare industry. There's a commonly used phrase referred to as the inverse of Moore's law, Eroom's law, Moore's law backwards, which makes an empirical observation that the number of FDA-approved drugs per $1 billion of inflation-adjusted R&D spend has gone down by approximately half every 9 years, pretty consistently since 1950. And it appears to be doing that, by the way, continually over the course of the current decade as well. And I find that paradoxical because, as I said, we are in an era where advances in drug discovery are as advanced as they've ever been. Drug discovery is booming. Innovation in biology is, I think, uncontroversially at an all-time high. New treatment modalities entering human clinical trials, some of them even reaching patients as approved products in ways that were not imagined 12 years ago when I personally began my career as a healthcare investor and turned entrepreneur several years ago. So that's a paradox. And the key bottleneck, I believe, is the actual drug development process that sits in between. That is where the majority of the $3 billion and 10-year average for a new drug approval ultimately rests, is in that process of translating that through human clinical trials, through a highly regulated process, all the way through the ultimate submission of a product for approval. And that's a cumbersome process that hasn't seen real major advances in the way that it's conducted. And new technology, while developed for other parts of drug discovery or the healthcare system more broadly, new technology has not really fundamentally changed the way that clinical trials are conducted, for example, the way drug development is ultimately carried out. And I believe the stakes for unlocking the productivity out of advances in drug discovery rest ultimately in effectively breaking down this dam and allowing that logjam to then be relieved. And I also believe that fixing that problem is the silent solution to fixing drug commercialization, where we see the opposite phenomenon to drug discovery. If we've seen major innovation in drug discovery over the last 10 years, we have not seen a meaningful iota of innovation in the way that drugs are commercialized. And there's a pretty intuitive reason for that. In order to innovate, you have to take risk. In order to take risk, you have to be willing to fail. And in order to be willing to fail, you have to have the latitude to fail. And if you have spent $3 billion in 10 years in getting a drug from discovery all the way to the finish line, the last place you're going to want to take actual innovative risk is in the commercialization process, which is why we have the same commercial models, the same pricing models, the same distribution models, the same sales and marketing models that we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But I think the silent key to unlocking that is actually bringing down the time and cost of drug development. And it's no surprise that as I'm personally passionate about this issue, this is where our company is focused. And I think that if we do reduce the time and cost of drug development, you solve the traffic jam upstream, and you also achieve greater latitude to experiment in commercialization downstream. And I think that as a believer that what's necessary is always possible, I believe that this is a trend we're going to see in terms of investment. In the interest of time, I'm actually not going to talk too much about our company. We have a unique approach that effectively operates on the philosophy that smaller is better for unlocking innovation in drug development and commercialization. So we're organized not as a single command and control operation, but as a decentralized federation of semi-autonomous or autonomous biotech companies operating under common ownership as part of a common platform. And the long story short is, among other ways to solve this problem, and there will be many, one of them may relate to actually behavioral changes that can reduce the time and cost of drug development, as well as technological changes. And my own view is, this is our company. There will be other companies that approach this in different ways, but this is effectively what the large pharma company of the future looks like, as an aggressively decentralized family of small biotech R&D units, which effectively is where most of the productivity is coming from in the industry today anyway. I'm going to shift gears, talk about the second contention. The problem with healthcare data rather than analytic power as applied to healthcare data. I'm sure you're all tired of hearing the same, trite observation that we have more healthcare data today than any other time in human history. It's true, but we are failing to fully leverage the power of those data sets. And the observation I would make is that we today, or maybe the venture capital industry specifically, is overly obsessed with identifying new AI, new machine learning, new analytic or computational power to be applied to healthcare data sets, but not enough investment going into solving the underlying data integration problem, which is specific to healthcare, relative to the development of AI or machine learning to other types of data sets in other fields. And a big part of the reason for that is healthcare data, more so than other data sets in other industries, is siloed, and it is de-identified in the way that we, for very good reasons, are able to deal with those data sets. And the rate-limiting step to unlocking analytic insight from those healthcare data sets, especially in the US healthcare system, if I'm here in the United States, my healthcare data on average sits in a couple hundred different locations today, none of which can be viewed by an outside party, some of which can't even be easily viewed by me, but all of which, when they are viewed, can't be associated with me or my identity. The rate-limiting problem in generating analytic insights is actually establishing linkages between, even if on a de-identified basis, linkages between the different data sets in which a given person's healthcare information occurs. And that's really, I believe, where we need to solve a data problem before we solve a computational problem, a fundamental data integration solution before we deliver an AI or machine learning-based solution. And we see, again, here in a very different way, a mismatch of investment relative to where the real underlying need lies. You know, I'm not going to preach at you. You've been hearing about it over the course of the day. Trillion gigabytes of healthcare data generated annually, a couple hundred different places in which that healthcare data rests. You know, the data silos exist between each of the institutions listed on this slide, each of whom have access to potentially the same patients who co-occur in another one of those institutions' data sets, and yet today remain siloed in ways that make that the rate-limiting step rather than computational power to unlocking analytic insight that we can actually use for applications like ones that we care about as a biopharma company, identifying patients for clinical trials, identifying patients to whom to serve commercialized medicines. But it could apply to other stakeholders in the healthcare system that would have other analytic applications to apply to that same integrated underlying data layer built in an integrated way across the board. And you know, in the interest of not overly boring you about, again, what our company is doing about it in one small way, we've established out of the problem that we faced in identifying patients for clinical trials, in identifying patients who would be apt for drug commercialization or targeting it through digital means, effectively, rather than building an internal infrastructure to solve this internally, launched a new business whose very mission was to address that data problem. Not as an analytics company, and this is crucial in drawing the difference, in understanding the difference between an analytics company and a data company, but starting as a data company to solve a data problem before analytics companies could ultimately harvest the power of what they had in terms of computational tools and machine learning algorithms to apply to that data network. And you know, as of today, we have 20% of the EMR data feeding into that network today, 80% of claims data, 85% of US mortality data feeding in. And crucially, I personally believe that consumer buying data is a form of healthcare data. Understanding on a de-identified basis what patients are buying, and today, through unique partnerships, we've reconceived of over-the-counter consumer buying data as healthcare data, with 60% of that over-the-counter buying data feeding into our network as well. The third thesis I'd like to conclude with is internal to biopharma investment. And here I mean biopharma investment in R&D collectively. The main problem I observe is that, and this is internal to the industry that I come from, the places where we, as an industry, are most spending our R&D dollars are dislocated from the areas in which innovative new medicines could actually reduce overall healthcare costs. And while innovation in those areas, such as cancer, such as specialized rarer diseases, could have meaningful positive impact on the lives of patients who benefit from those medicines, may not reduce healthcare system cost, but may at worst add to it. And in my opinion, to solve this problem, it's going to require a novel means by which all stakeholders ultimately work together to set up the right incentives and the right investment decision-making structure for pharma R&D to shift its priorities to areas such as cardiometabolic disease, such as diabetes, such as Alzheimer's disease. If I'm looking at the number of FDA approvals of new drugs over each of the last 5 years, we see a disproportionate number of those approvals coming in oncology, coming in rare diseases, but not enough. Infectious disease is an interesting separate topic. Multi-drug resistant bacterial infections are a major problem in hospitals and a major killer today. But if I'm looking at the contributions to societal healthcare cost, I'm thinking about complications of obesity. I'm thinking about type 2 diabetes. I'm thinking about Alzheimer's disease. And these are areas where we have not seen a meaningful iota of innovation over the course, at least as measured by approved products, over the course of the last decade. And I would contend that that's a problem. It's not necessarily, it's obviously not a bad thing for patients who are suffering from cancer, suffering from other serious diseases to benefit from the meaningful innovation that we as an industry have delivered. But opting for more of that is at the benefit of improving individual patients, actually adding overall healthcare system cost rather than subtracting from it, as opposed to addressing the real problem, which is a heat map of what the obesity rates look like across the United States today. And the question is, what can we do collectively to ensure that biopharmaceutical companies, the real innovators in the development of medicines, are ultimately setting their priorities in a manner that aligns with where real healthcare system needs are? I think there's a lot of answers to that question. Some would start from where a regulatory path has been set. Clearly, I think the FDA has been extremely successful in engendering innovation in oncology and rare diseases, and we have seen the industry response to that. I think there are issues that are internal to pharma, culturally and otherwise, incentive alignment issues that need to be addressed. This is what companies like us exist to do in building an alternative model. But I think a longer range solution involves some type of vertical integration in the way that R&D decisions ultimately get made. One idea. When you think about the ways in which health insurance companies ultimately invest the proceeds from the sales of their products, it's a little bit counterintuitive that that should be invested in random securities, in random instruments that are sort of financial vehicles to effectively run an insurance company in the way that one would expect, rather than helping direct that investment towards developing real innovation that ultimately forestalls the costs downstream for the members of a given insurance plan. So I would find it, I'm hearing that I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up here and save any discussion for the cocktail hour soon to follow. But an interesting idea may be at least an early first step in that direction of vertical integration in investment from insurance companies, from the proceeds of the various products that insurance companies sell, the premium that they collect, not in random investments in other financial vehicles, but rather in playing a more pivotal role in shaping the objectives of R&D to make sure that the problems that are going to bankrupt, that the health problems that are going to bankrupt our healthcare system are going to be the ones that the very people who were bearing that cost ultimately took accountability upstream for in investing in the kind of innovation that could forestall or avoid those costs altogether. And I ultimately think it's going to take a solution like that or a dramatic solution like it in order to redirect R&D spending from our industry, which I think is completely focused in the wrong place if you're sitting as a downstream stakeholder in the healthcare system in looking at how the potential of that innovation could be harnessed in a direction that actually could reduce the cost problems that we face over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and look forward to meeting many of you at the cocktail hour.